since we're here as Catholics who are scientists, right? It's fitting to, and there's many more lines of evidence that you could have produced and applied reason to try to draw conclusions about Christianity, about Jesus' resurrection. There's one I wanted to ask you about, and I say that because it's a very striking photograph of a crucified man who was buried, and the nail, the Roman nail, is still lodged in his foot. Just one of the many archaeological finds in that region from that time period that shows evidence, obviously, of Roman practice of crucifixion, but also it has some other. Well, it's an example of a crucified person who was buried, which is, I think, is just an example. There aren't maybe too many of those, because there's the idea that the Romans left crucified people's bodies on the cross, for a long time. And of course, we have in the Gospel of Mark and others, there's the account of Jesus' body being taken down and buried. So and it's consonant with that these things did happen, right? That crucified people were buried. So let's expand the scope or the circle of you can apply reason to the New Testament, and then what else can you apply reason to test the claims of Christianity and specifically of the resurrection, so that you haven't had time to talk about today, maybe in future episodes?
Sure. So as far as archaeological evidence, it's one that's really interesting that sort of corroborates the reason perhaps the New Testament should be taken seriously is the Pool of Siloam by the Sheep's Gate in Jerusalem. For centuries, sort of opponents of Christianity would mock Christianity itself, sort of like, oh, there's really no archaeological evidence, and fairly recently it was discovered that this pool was there, and it was indeed in the place, and it met all the descriptions that were given about it in the gospel. And what I'm getting at here is, I think, an important aspect of all valid historical sort of knowledge and looking and trying to look deeper into it is there should be a methodology. And although testimony is certainly a powerful thing, it's important to look at sort of the archaeological evidence and to look at things scientifically. So sort of three criteria maybe that would be useful to look at. One, we should always approach sort of historical things with an eye of open-mindedness but also skepticism, because especially in ancient times a lot of dubious claims were made, so it's important that we have reasonable evidence to presuppose certain beliefs. The second thing is that it's important to, as we look at the evidence for something, see whether it logically makes sense and it's the most likely option. Like, something could be logically possible but not make sense. And then the final thing that I would say to that is it's important to look at whether it's consistent with external history and with also other internal sources regarding these claims. That would sort of be my main framework. Are there any other questions as we wrap this up in the next few minutes?
So, okay, I have a second question. This is one that maybe you hear a lot in maybe younger circles, but it may be a conception or a preconceived notion that a lot of people have. Can you argue for or against the idea that the people who lived 2,000 years ago in the Roman world and its environs were more ignorant, more gullible, or less able to apply logic than people who are alive today? So, true or false on those?
So as far as formal education goes, it is true that the literacy rates were around 10% at that time. Although I would argue that in some ways there were certainly people who are much more intelligent as far as like memorization and these sort of things. Like people had memorized entire oral traditions, which is not very common today. So although they might have not been educated or had sort of scientific evidence, they were certainly very reasonable people that were able to formulate their own ideas and apply logic to situations. I mean, to cite one quick example, I believe it was either Julius or Augustus Caesar, I can't remember. He remembered the name of every single soldier in his army, one of his legions, supposedly. And the fact that someone could do that sort of shows that, yeah, maybe he wasn't educated, he didn't have a college degree, but he certainly had a good memory, knew how to apply reason in a manner that would be equal or perhaps even greater than many people would employ today. Thank you.